The town of Harlow Creek, Montana sat pressed between pine ridges and frozen flatland like a place the interstate forgot. Population 1,847. One main street, two gas stations, a diner that closed at 7, and a railroad yard 15 miles east that kept the town alive by a thread of steel and diesel smoke. The winters came hard and stayed long, and the people who remained after their 20s had made a decision about the kind of life they wanted, which was a life that didn't ask too many questions and didn't offer too many answers, and that rewarded showing up more than it rewarded anything else. The Iron Ridge Riders came through every morning at 6:47. 14 bikes, no deviation. Harley Softails, a couple of Dynas. One Sportster that backfired on cold starts and announced itself half a mile before it arrived. They worked the rail yard welders, freight handlers, crane operators, men who showed up before the sun did and didn't talk much after. The convoy was ritual, engine noise instead of conversation, leather against wind instead of explanation. It had been the same route for 6 years, the same time, the same formation, and the consistency of it had become something the town oriented around the way small towns oriented around things that never changed, which were usually the things worth keeping. Weston Gallagher led the pack, 43 years old, 6'1", a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the mountains he rode through every morning. His beard had gone gray at the edges 2 winters ago, and he hadn't thought much about it since. There was a steel rod in his left leg, placed there by a Marine Corps surgeon in a field hospital outside Fallujah after an IED took out the Humvee he'd been riding in and turned the 3 men beside him into something he had spent 19 years trying not to see when he closed his eyes. The rod was titanium. It held the femur together and it ached in cold weather in a way that lived below the surface of ordinary pain, in the metal itself which held cold longer than flesh did and released it slower. He walked with a slight hitch on bad mornings. He didn't mention it. Nobody asked. His road name was Stone. He'd earned it not because he was hard, though he was, but because of the particular stillness that came over him in the situations that made other men loud. The kind of stillness that had a weight to it. The kind that filled a room before he said a word and stayed after he left. Men who'd ridden with him for years described it the same way without consulting each other. You always knew where Stone was in a room, even when you weren't looking at him. He didn't wave at people, didn't smile at strangers, didn't do much of anything except ride and work and sit in the quiet of his rented 1-bedroom apartment on nights when sleep wouldn't come, which was most nights. He'd made a kind of peace with that, not the comfortable kind, the kind that was just the shape of the life he had, and he'd stopped fighting the shape of it sometime around year 15 and started working within it instead. You showed up, you did the work. You didn't put the parts of yourself that weren't useful onto other people. He noticed things, though. That part hadn't switched off and probably never would. The part that counted exits when he walked into rooms and memorized faces he'd seen before and filed small details that other people stepped over. It had kept him alive in places where missing small details meant not coming home, and it had followed him home like everything else from those places quietly without asking permission. He noticed the girl. She was small, maybe 6 years old. A tangle of red-brown hair that the wind caught every morning and turned into something wild. Bare feet on the cracked sidewalk outside a house on Maple Street, a pale yellow foster home called Shepherd House, run by the county licensed for 4 children, with a porch that sagged in the center and windows covered by bedsheets tacked up instead of curtains. The yard was dead grass and frozen mud and a rusted swing set with 1 seat missing. A child's bicycle with a broken chain lay on its side near the steps, and it had been there long enough that the handlebars had started to rust. She stood there every morning at 6:47 with both arms raised, waving the way people waved at planes. Not the polite flick of the wrist that meant hello. Both arms fully extended, moving with the specific urgency of someone trying to flag down something before it disappeared and didn't come back. Nothing casual about it. Nothing performed. Just desperate, unfiltered hope offered up to 14 motorcycles that came through at the same time every morning and would come through again tomorrow whether she was there or not. The first morning Stone saw her, he didn't wave back. Kids waved at bikes. That was normal. He filed it and kept riding. The second morning, Darnell Briggs' riding sweep, 31 years old, burns on his forearms from welding sparks. A baby daughter he saw every other weekend threw the girl a casual salute. She lit up, not smiled, lit up, like something switched on behind her eyes that had been dark for a while. Darnell looked back at Stone and raised an eyebrow, and Stone said nothing and they kept going. The third morning, all 14 riders waved. After that, it became part of the route, a checkpoint, something the convoy oriented around without anyone deciding to. The girl was always there, same spot, same time, same frantic waving that had something underneath it. Stone couldn't name yet, but recognized the way you recognized a sound heard in a different context, not from logic, but from the place below logic where the body stored its longer memory. The riders waved back. No names, no stopping, just acknowledgement. A moment of connection in a world that didn't seem to be offering her much else. Stone started watching more carefully, not in a way that required words or action, just in the way a man with too many miles behind him learned to read what other people stepped over. He noticed the way she stood too still when the waving stopped, like the animation drained out of her the moment the engines faded, and she was left with whatever the house behind her contained. He noticed the way her shoulders pulled inward when the front door opened. He noticed she was always in the same faded orange shirt, regardless of temperature. Montana mornings in late October ran below freezing, and the sidewalk was salted white with frost. But she never wore a coat, never wore shoes that fit, sometimes wore no shoes at all. He noticed the way she watched the bikes disappear around the corner, like she was watching the only thing tethering her to the surface of the world, and what happened to her face in the moment after they were gone. He noticed one morning in mid-October that she kept her right hand behind her back when she waved, using only her left. He noticed the way she positioned her body so the right side faced away from the road. He noticed the purple-black bruising along the outside of her right hand, visible for just a moment when the wind shifted her hair and the morning light hit the right angle. He didn't stop the convoy, didn't say anything. He filed it in that part of his brain that cataloged things before he decided what to do with them, and let the road take him forward. 3 months the girl stood there. 3 months the convoy waved. Through October into November, into the first hard freeze of December, into the particular cold of a Montana winter that stopped being weather and became a physical presence that pressed against everything and stayed. Every single morning, same spot, same arms, same desperate, unfiltered hope. Darnell noticed things too because Darnell had a daughter, and men with daughters developed a secondary attention that ran underneath everything else, quiet and constant. One evening in the third week of November, sitting on the loading dock at the rail yard with sandwiches, neither of them ate, Darnell said, "You see that kid every morning?" Stone nodded. "She always alone." "Yeah, Shepherd House." He said it the way people said names of places they'd heard about and didn't have good associations with. "My cousin's kid was in the system for 2 years. Came out wrong, didn't talk right, flinched at everything for a long time after." Stone set his coffee down on the dock railing. The fluorescent lights in the break room behind them cast a pale stripe across the concrete. Somewhere in the yard, a freight horn sounded twice. "You think something is wrong," Stone said. Darnell looked out at the rail lines. He stirred his coffee with a stick that had already dissolved. "I think kids don't wave like that unless they need to." That stayed with Stone, planted itself in the part of his brain that cataloged things before he'd decided what to do with them. He started paying attention to the house itself on the passes, the peeling paint, the mailbox that leaned the windows with their makeshift curtains, the porch soft in the center. There were other children. He saw them sometimes. Faces in windows, shadows moving behind glass, but the red-haired girl was the only one who came outside, the only one who waved. Then on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December at 6:46, 1 minute before the convoy reached Maple Street, Darnell pulled up beside Stone at a four-way stop 2 blocks out. The light was red, 4 cars in front of them. Stone heard something, small feet on asphalt, moving fast. He turned. She was already there, bare feet on frozen pavement, the orange shirt hair wild in the morning wind, moving with the desperation of a child who has decided to do something terrifying before she can talk herself out of it. She came straight to his bike. Her eyes were enormous and doing something complicated, measuring him, estimating the distance between what she needed and what she could expect, deciding whether to cross it. She didn't say anything. She reached out with her left hand and tucked something into the leather saddlebag at his right knee. Small, and folded the movement quick and practiced like she'd rehearsed it. Then she looked up at him. 1 second. Eyes that were too old for her face. Eyes that had been doing this kind of calculation for longer than a 6-year-old should have been doing it. The light changed. The cars moved. The convoy rolled. Stone looked in his mirror, and she was standing at the corner watching them go, arms at her sides, for once not waving, just watching until they disappeared. He forgot about it through the shift, or tried to. The saddlebag carried tools and a rain cover and a folded map he hadn't needed in years, and whatever she'd put in there settled into the bottom of it, and the rail yard swallowed the morning the way it always did, loud and cold and relentless, the kind of work that didn't leave much room for anything else while you were in it. He found it that night. He was cleaning the bag out on his kitchen table, looking for a wrench he'd misplaced, when his hand closed on something small and folded. A piece of paper creased so many times it had gone soft at the edges, the fibers starting to separate along the fold lines. He unfolded it under the kitchen light. 7 words. Pencil. The handwriting of a child who'd learned her letters but hadn't had much practice stringing them into sentences. The letters uneven in size, some reversed the whole message, listing slightly uphill, like the paper had moved while she wrote. Please don't go away. Stone sat at his kitchen table for a long time looking at those 7 words. He thought about the orange shirt, the bare feet on frozen pavement, the hand she'd kept behind her back. He thought about 3 months of waving that had always had something underneath it he could name, now the same way he could name the sound of a truck backfiring versus the sound of something that wasn't a truck. Not from logic, but from a body that had learned the difference between normal and wrong and stored that knowledge below thought. He put the paper in his jacket pocket. Not in the trash, not left on the table. In his pocket against his chest where he'd feel it when he moved. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning at 6:47, the convoy came through the 4-way stop, turned onto Maple Street, rolled past Shepherd House at the usual speed. The sidewalk was empty. Stone's hand tightened on the throttle. In his peripheral vision, he caught Darnell looking at the empty corner, then at him. Behind them, Knox Weaver riding third-shaped head, a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a man who chose his words the way some people chose how to spend money they didn't have much of, said nothing. But his eyes went to the empty sidewalk, then to the house, then to the back of Stone's helmet, where they stayed. They kept the convoy moving. The rhythm didn't break. But something had shifted in the space between the riders. Something felt rather than said, the way things were communicated between men who'd spent enough time together that language had become optional for the important things. At the rail yard, Stone welded the same seam 3 times and burned through it on the 3rd pass and had to start over. His supervisor watched without comment, which meant he'd noticed and had decided not to make it worse. Stone worked through the morning and didn't eat at lunch and stared at the loading dock railing where Darnell had said kids don't wave like that unless they need to, and found he had no appetite for anything except the thing he was already deciding to do. That afternoon, after the shift ended and the yard cleared, the 3 of them rode back to Maple Street. The sun was already down. December in Montana meant dark by 4:30, and the temperature had dropped another 12 degrees since morning. Frost was forming on windshields and fence posts. The pine trees at the edge of the yard stood absolutely still in the windless cold. Shepherd House looked worse in the fading light. The porch had a soft spot in the center that the boards had given up trying to conceal. The mailbox leaned. The rusted bicycle was still in the dead grass. A dog barked somewhere behind the fence once and went quiet. Stone killed his engine at the curb. Darnell and Knox followed. The silence after the engines died had a texture to it, dense and watchful, like the street itself was paying attention. He walked up the cracked driveway and climbed the 3 steps to the porch. The wood creaked under his weight. He knocked 3 times firm enough to be heard, not aggressive, the knock of a man who intended to stand there until someone answered. Nothing. He knocked again. A shadow moved behind the window. Then the door opened 4 inches on a chain. A woman's face appeared in the gap. Mid-40s, hair pulled back tight, eyes that moved quickly across Stone's face, and then to his hands, and then to Darnell and Knox behind him, assessing everything in the space of 2 seconds. Beverly Oates. Stone would learn that name later. Right now, she was just the face in the gap and the quality of stillness. She was performing the stillness of someone managing their own reaction rather than simply having one. Can I help you? I'm looking for the little girl, red hair, about 6. She usually stands out front in the mornings. Why? Want to make sure she's okay. Something tightened around Beverly Oates' eyes. Not surprise. Something more calculated than surprise. She's fine. Can I talk to her? No. Why not? Because I said so. A pause. Who are you? Someone who rides past every morning. She waves at us. We wave back. We haven't seen her today. The door started to close. Stone put his hand on the frame, not forcing it, just stopping it. Her eyes went wide. Get your hand off my door, or I'm calling the police. Call them. I'm serious. So am I. Darnell stepped up behind him. Ma'am, we're not trying to cause trouble. We just want to know the girl's okay. Beverly looked past Stone at the two men in the driveway. Something moved across her face, not quite fear, but the thing that lived next to fear when a person had enough experience to know that some situations required a different kind of management. She's not here, she said. She was moved to another placement this morning. Standard procedure. Now get off my property. Stone looked at her, at the eyes that still hadn't made real contact, at the hands gripping the door's edge, at the way she'd said standard procedure, the way people said things they'd practiced saying. He stepped back. The door closed. The deadbolt clicked a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. The three of them stood on the porch in the cold and didn't move for a moment. The rusted bicycle lay in the yard. The swing set's one remaining seat moved slightly in a wind that had picked up from the north. Knox said very quietly, with the specificity he brought to all his observations, "She's lying." "Yeah," Stone said. They came back the next morning. Not three of them. Word had moved through the chapter the way it always moved, not through announcement or formal communication, but through the frequency that traveled between men who'd ridden together long enough that they could distinguish between situations that required a response and situations that didn't. 31 Iron Ridge riders rolled down Maple Street at 6:47. They didn't block the street, didn't rev engines, didn't shout or gesture, or do anything that could be characterized as threatening. They rolled slowly, slowly enough to be counted, to be seen, to be remembered, and then they parked along both sides of the block and cut their engines and stood. Leather vests and scarred hands and faces that had been in weather for decades. Men who drove rivets and welded freight cars and hauled crane loads and showed up before the sun did. Standing on a residential street on a Tuesday morning, doing nothing that any law in Montana could touch, which was exactly what they were doing and which was the point. Neighbors came onto porches. A car slowed and then drove on. Two kids waiting for a school bus stared until the bus came and they had no choice. At 7:15, a county sheriff's deputy pulled up, got out, walked over to Stone. Young professional not looking for trouble. They talked for 12 minutes. Stone answered every question calmly and completely. Yes, they were parked legally. No, they weren't blocking traffic. Yes, they'd move if the property owner asked them to. No, the property owner had not asked. The deputy made notes, looked at the line of bikes, looked at the house, made more notes, got back in his cruiser and drove away. At 7:40, Beverly Oates appeared at the front window and stood there for a long time looking at the line of men. Then the curtain dropped. At 11:30, a white Department of Family Services van arrived. Two women got out with clipboards in the professional calm of people who'd learned to hold their faces steady regardless of what they were walking into. They knocked. Beverly answered. They went inside. 31 men stood on Maple Street and waited. 40 minutes later, the women came back out. One of them was on her phone. The other was writing in rapid, careful notes. They got back in the van and left without looking at the line of riders. At 2 in the afternoon, two more vans arrived. State investigators, a deputy, a woman with a camera. At 2:47, the front door of Shepherd House opened. 7 children walked out into the December afternoon, blinking in the pale winter sunlight, like they'd been somewhere darker than the season accounted for. Small and quiet and careful in the way children got when they'd learned that the next thing was often worse than the last, and that the appropriate response to new situations was to take up as little space as possible and wait to see what was required. Rosie was the fourth one out, 6 years old. The orange shirt, bare feet in the cold. No one had thought to put shoes on her in the rush, or no one had bothered. Bruising along her right forearm, visible even from the curb. A cut above her left eye that had closed on its own without being cleaned, the dried blood still at the edge of it. She walked out and stood on the porch and looked at the line of bikes and the line of men, and her expression was not what Stone had expected. Not relief, not tears, just a careful, serious, measuring assessment, the same eyes that had looked up at him at the four-way stop when she pushed the paper into his saddlebag. doing the calculation, deciding what this was before she committed to feeling anything about it. Stone crossed the dead grass to the porch steps. He lowered himself to the ground, his left knee screaming from the hours of cold and the steel rod registering every degree of temperature, and he sat on the porch boards in front of her, not crouching over her, not reaching, just sitting at her level where she didn't have to look up at him and where she could see his hands. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment didn't already hold. She looked at him for a longer time. The way she looked at things, she was trying to understand before she committed to a response. Then she reached out very slowly with her left hand and put two fingers on the back of his right hand. Not holding it, just making contact with the thing she'd been waving at for 3 months, confirming it was real. A caseworker appeared at her shoulder, Karen Slater. Early 30s, dark hair. The quiet efficiency of someone who did hard work and had made a decision not to flinch at it. She put her hand gently on Rosie's shoulder. "We need to go now, sweetheart." Rosie looked at Karen, then back at Stone. She took her fingers away from his hand. Stone stood slowly, the knee announcing itself, and stepped back. Said nothing because nothing he could say was adequate. Karen walked Rosie to the van. Rosie went without resistance. She had practice with vans and new places and strangers who meant well and systems that had their own logic. She climbed in. The door started to slide closed. She turned and looked through the window, found Stone's face without searching for it, like she'd memorized where he'd be. She didn't wave. She just looked at him with those two old eyes, steady and serious, and memorizing like she was storing the image of him somewhere she could find again. The van pulled out. Stone stood on the sidewalk and watched it go. His hands were loose at his sides. Behind him, 30 other men watched in silence as the van turned the corner and disappeared. Nobody said anything. The street was very quiet. The rusted bicycle was still in the yard, and it occurred to Stone that nobody had brought it with them, and it would just sit there rusting until someone came to deal with the property. Darnell appeared at his shoulder. "We got her out." He said it like a fact he was still deciding what to feel about. Stone didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and his hand closed on the folded paper, soft at the edges from weeks of being carried. His phone rang. A number he recognized. Frank Decker. 62 years old, a cane he'd needed for 4 years. A drinking problem managed but not solved. A mind that had spent 2 decades as a financial crimes investigator for the county before his knees in a case that went wrong had pushed him out the door. Stone had met him years back through a mutual acquaintance and found him useful in the specific way that certain people were useful, not because they were reliable, but because they knew things, for the right reason would say them. He answered. Frank's voice was lower than usual, careful in a way that made the back of Stone's neck respond to things that required attention. "I need to meet with you tonight, in person." "What about?" A pause, 3 full seconds. "That little girl," Frank said. "There's something about her situation you don't know. And you need to." Stone looked at the empty space where the van had been. "Where?" he said. "Patton's Diner, Route 2, 8 o'clock. Stone put the phone back in his pocket. Knox came up beside him. He'd heard the tone, if not the words. "Tonight," Knox said. "Yeah." Knox looked at the house, at the investigators moving in and out. Then he looked at Stone. "I'll ride with you." "I've got it." "I know you've got it. I'll ride with you." Stone didn't argue. He got on his bike. The engine caught and the sound of it went through him the way it always did. Not loud now, just present the vibration that had become the closest thing he had to a kind of quiet. 31 bikes pulled out of Maple Street, slow and low through the December afternoon, and Stone rode at the front and thought about 7 words written in a child's unsteady pencil. He had 6 hours until 8 o'clock. He used 3 of them at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He didn't drink the paper unfolded in front of him under the kitchen light, turning over everything he thought he knew about the situation and examining the parts that didn't hold together when you looked at them directly. The coffee went cold. The light outside the window went dark before 5 o'clock, the way it did in December in Montana. He sat with the cold coffee and the 7 words and the weight of a man who knows something has started and cannot see where it ends. Patton's Diner on Route 2 had been there since 1971 and looked every year of it. Vinyl booths repaired with electrical tape, a counter with 8 stools, a pie case with 3 varieties on a turntable that had needed oiling since roughly the Reagan administration. The coffee was consistently bad in the way that certain things were consistently anything through repetition rather than intention. It was the kind of place that didn't try to be other than what it was, which Stone had always found more honest than most. He got there at 7:50. Frank Decker was already in the back booth facing the door, a cup of coffee in front of him untouched, a manila folder on the table closed, one hand resting flat on top of it. Frank looked 68, though he was 62. The years had settled on him in the way they settled on men who carried things they didn't put down often enough. Gray hair gone nearly white at the temples, a cane hooked on the seat beside him, eyes that were still sharp, still paying attention, still cataloging behind everything else. Stone slid into the booth across from him. A waitress poured coffee without being asked and left. Frank opened the folder without preamble and turned it so Stone could read. Inside was a printout, a spreadsheet dense with names, dates, and placement identification numbers. Stone found the name he was looking for in the fourth row. Her name is Rosie June Holloway, Frank said. 6 years old, mother deceased car accident 18 months ago. Father is James Holloway, currently at Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge. Armed robbery, 3 years into a 5-year sentence. Stone looked at the dates beside Rosie's name, the spacing of the entries, the progression of placements. This is her fourth placement in 3 years, Frank said. First dissolved when the mother died and the state took custody. Second was a family placement that lasted 4 months. Third was Shepherd House, 7 months. Every single one of these transfers, Rosie's and every other name on this list, was coordinated by the same person. Raymond Holden, 54 years old, private placement coordinator licensed by the state operating across 5 counties in northern Montana. Stone looked at the name, Raymond Holden. It meant nothing to him yet, but the way Frank said it told him it would. What does a private placement coordinator do? Stone said. Officially, he acts as an intermediary between the state's overloaded child welfare system and private foster families and group facilities. Finds placements for children the state doesn't have immediate capacity for. Handles the paperwork, coordinates transitions. Frank paused. The pause of a man who had been deciding how much truth to spend. That's the official version. Tell me the other one. Frank's hand moved on the folder. Not nervous, something older than nervous. Group homes and residential facilities pay higher coordination fees than private family placements. When a child is in a stable family placement, the fee is a one-time amount. When a child gets moved to a group facility, Holden receives a cut of the daily rate. When that child gets moved again, he gets another cut. Frank's voice had gone flat. He's been doing this for 11 years. The state has never audited him because his paperwork is clean and his placement numbers are high. In the system's language, he's efficient. Stone looked at the list of names, a column of ages beside each one. The youngest was 4. He destabilizes placements deliberately, Stone said. Creates friction where there wasn't any. Files reports noting adjustment difficulties, behavioral concerns, resource limitations. All technically within the bounds of his role. All generating another transfer, another fee. Frank looked at his untouched coffee. Every child on this list has been moved at least 3 times. Most of them more. Stone sat with the specific enormity of it. A machine designed to look like a system while functioning as something else entirely, and the children inside it unable to name what was happening because they didn't have the language. And because the people who did have the language were benefiting from the machine. You said there was something specific about Rosie, Stone said. Frank was quiet for a moment, his hand pressed flat on the folder. I've known about Holden's pattern for 6 weeks, he said. I came to you tonight because her situation became visible today, because 31 bikers on Maple Street made it impossible to manage quietly anymore. Stone looked at him across the table, at the folder, at the hand on top of it, at the space between what Frank was saying and what he wasn't. You've known for 6 weeks, Stone said. You came to me tonight because you had to, not because you decided to. Frank didn't deny it. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at it, set it down without drinking. There's more to Holden's network than I've shown you, he said. He opened the folder to the second page. A different spreadsheet, a payment distribution ledger, handwritten and photographed and printed. Columns of names, dates, dollar amounts. In the far right column, a set of initials beside each payment. Stone read down the column, stopped at 2 letters. ND. Who is ND, Stone said. Frank's hand came up to the side of his face. The gesture of a man reaching for something to hold on to that wasn't there. Nathan Decker. he said. He said it the way a man said the name of something that had been destroying him from the inside for a long time, and that he had finally, in this moment, said out loud to another person. He's a family court intake coordinator in Billings. He processes emergency placement requests. He's been flagging certain children for Holden's pipeline children with no family advocates, no attorneys, no one watching closely, and routing them to Holden's coordination network. A pause. Nathan receives a percentage of the coordination fees, 11 payments over 18 months averaging just under $2,000 each. Stone looked at him. At the name Frank had just said, at the face of a man who had built a career on financial crimes investigation and understood precisely what he was describing. Nathan Decker, Stone said. My son, Frank said. Son? Just that, the two words of a man who had spent 6 weeks trying to find a different arrangement for them and couldn't. The diner's pie case turned slowly on its turntable. The coffee machine made a sound. A couple in the front booth talked quietly about something that had nothing to do with what was happening in the back booth. Stone looked at the folder, at the payment ledger, at the name that appeared 11 times with amounts beside it categorized as consulting fees, hidden in plain sight, in financial disclosures that no one had looked at carefully enough until Frank Decker had looked at them and then spent 6 weeks deciding what to do about what he'd found. He understood the shape of it now. Frank bringing him to Holden, Frank showing him the pattern, Frank steering him toward the coordinator and away from the financial records where the network was documented, where his son's name appeared 11 times. 6 weeks of carrying it. 6 weeks of calculating whether there was a version of this where Nathan wasn't in the center. Tonight, when 31 bikers on Maple Street had made the situation impossible to manage, quietly, Frank had come. With the folder half open, with the part that mattered most held back. You've been steering me, Stone said, toward Holden and away from the financial records. Frank didn't deny it. Your son is in the pipeline, Stone said, and you came here tonight because the situation changed and you needed to stay in front of it. Frank's jaw worked. He looked at the table. He looked like a man who had put something down and discovered it had been attached to him and was pulling pieces of him with it as it fell. He's my son, Frank said. A statement about why it had taken 6 weeks and why he was here at all at the same time. Stone stood. He put money on the table for the coffee he hadn't touched. He picked up his jacket. I'll find the rest of it myself, he said. He drove back to the chapter garage, a converted rail depot on the eastern edge of Harlow Creek with a wood stove and a pool table and walls covered in patches and photographs of men who'd ridden before them and men who'd ridden with them and weren't there anymore. Gunnar Pierce was already there when Stone arrived. Gunnar Pierce ran the chapter out of Billings 90 miles south. 51 years old. Gray beard cut close, eyes the color of February sky that had the quality of things that had been cold for a long time and stopped apologizing for it. He had a stillness that matched Stone's own in a way that made communication between them efficient, two men who'd learned to say a great deal with very little. He'd ridden up that afternoon when word reached Billings, had been on Maple Street for the last 2 hours of the standoff without being asked, had said nothing the entire time, except at the end to Knox, good. Stone told him about Frank Decker, about Nathan Decker, about the payment ledger and the 11 payments and the routing of children into Holden's pipeline. Gunnar listened without interrupting. When Stone finished, he was quiet for a moment. The wood stove crackled. The overhead light was yellow and old. I have a contact at the Billings County Clerk's office, Gunnar said. 20-year employee. She's been paying attention to things in that office for reasons that have nothing to do with us, and she owes Nathan Decker nothing. Can she access the placement coordination records? The publicly accessible ones. Cross-reference the financial disclosures. Gunnar looked at the stove. 2 days, maybe less. Make the call, Stone said. 2 days later, Gunnar came back with what the woman had found. The name was in the financial disclosure column third from the bottom under a contractor classification that could mean several things to someone not looking carefully and meant one specific thing to someone who was. Nathan Decker, Billings Family Court. Payment dates that corresponded precisely with the transfer dates in Holden's placement ledger. Stone sat with it for an hour. Not the facts, those were clear, the weight of it, the specific gravity of a child who had been used as a revenue source by a system built to protect her and whose father's old friend had known about it for 6 weeks and chosen his own son over her. Then he drove to Frank Decker's house. Frank answered before Stone knocked twice. He'd been waiting. The door opened and Frank stood in it, and his face had the expression of a man who had been counting down to a particular moment and had arrived at it. Stone held up the page with Nathan's name on it. He didn't say anything. Frank looked at the paper. His hand on the door frame tightened once and released. "He's my son," Frank said, the only thing he had left. "I know," Stone said, "and she's 6 years old." He turned and walked back to his truck. He drove for 40 minutes without a destination out onto the highway east of Harlow Creek, where the road ran flat and straight and visible for miles. He thought about Frank, about the calculation Frank had been making for 6 weeks and what it had cost Rosie. He thought about the particular damage done by people who did terrible things for reasons that were almost understandable, which was somehow worse than the damage done by people who did terrible things for no reason at all. Then he thought about Rosie, about a placement transfer that had happened before any of this came into the light. Holden moving her before the visibility of the situation at Shepherd House could complicate his operation. Moving her to Sunrise Group Home in Billings, a place where Nathan Decker processed paperwork and nothing had changed yet. He turned the truck around. The call from Karen Slater came 3 days later at 3:15 in the morning. Rosie had run away from the group home in Billings, discovered missing at 2:45 when a night staff member made rounds. A side door that didn't latch properly. No other signs. Karen had run out of better options. She had Stone's number from the day at Shepherd House. She had a feeling, though she couldn't have said exactly where it came from, that if anyone knew where Rosie might go, it was the man who'd been waving at her every morning for 3 months. Stone was already on his bike before the call ended. He called Knox. Knox answered on the first ring. "Maple Street," Stone said. 10 minutes, Knox said. They arrived from different directions, cutting engines a block out and coasting the last stretch in silence. Maple Street at 3 in the morning was a street in suspension. Shepherd House empty, now with crime scene tape across the porch, fluttering in the cold, the windows dark, the broken bicycle still in the dead grass yard. The street light nearest the house was out. The one half a block down through a pale oval on the cracked sidewalk where Rosie had stood every morning for 3 months. Stone scanned methodically. Porch, yard, side of the house. The gap between the foundation shrubs and the concrete stoop. He saw her. Wedged into the corner where the concrete steps met the dormant juniper bushes pressed into the pocket they made was Rosie, knees to her chest. An adult's coat 3 sizes too large wrapped around her, the kind of coat that ended up in a group home's lost and found bin. Rubber sandals on her feet open-toed, hair loose, eyes open. She hadn't been sleeping. She'd been waiting. Stone got off his bike slowly. The steel rod in his left leg registered the temperature of 3 a.m. Montana December without apology. He crossed the dead grass and stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and lowered himself down, sitting on the cold ground at her level 10 feet from her. Not approaching, just being at the same height in the same cold. She looked at him, the calculation moving behind her eyes. "You came back," she said. Her voice was very small, thin from cold and from whatever the last 72 hours had been. "Yeah," Stone said. "I waved at you, at the other place, through the window of the van. I saw you. Did you wave back?" "I did." She looked at her knees, considering this. "I didn't see." "I waved," Stone said. The single remaining seat of the swing set made a sound in the wind. Knox stood at the corner of the block, leaning against his bike with his arms crossed, watching the street in both directions. He'd positioned himself between the house and the road without anyone asking him to. Old instinct, good instinct. "Are you hurt?" Stone said. Rosie shook her head. "Are you cold?" The smallest hesitation, a point of pride she'd been maintaining. Then another head shake. He unzipped his jacket and held it out to her. She looked at it for a long moment, the look of a child who'd learned not to take things too quickly, who understood that things offered could be taken back and that the taking back was worse than never having had them. Then she reached out and took it, pulled it around herself. It covered her completely. She disappeared inside it. Stone sat on the cold concrete without moving. He looked at the empty house, the dark windows, the bicycle in the yard. "Why did you come here?" he said. Rosie was quiet for a moment. Then matter-of-factly, the way she said things that were obvious to her, "Because you're always here." Something in Stone's chest shifted, not sharply. The way things shifted when they'd been held in place by a long tension, and the tension released enormous and slow and not entirely comfortable. "Not always," he said. "In the mornings," she said. "You're always here in the mornings." "Yeah." She pulled his jacket tighter. The wind moved through the dead grass in the yard. The other place smelled wrong, she said. The group home? She nodded. What did it smell like? She thought about it carefully the way she thought about everything. Like the other places. He understood without her explaining. He'd known places like that. The specific absence of anything personal. The smell of institutional cleaning products and recycled air, and too many people in too little space with too little that belonged to them. He'd known it in field hospitals and processing centers and temporary places in 3 countries, and whatever it smelled like exactly, it smelled like impermanence, like a place that wasn't going to become anything, and knew it. I have something, Rosie said. She reached inside the oversized coat and pulled out a small plastic Ziploc bag sealed carefully at the top. Inside it, folded small, were several pieces of paper. Napkins mostly, a few scraps of notebook paper, all of them with writing, small, careful pencil, writing the handwriting of a child working hard at something because she understood it mattered. She held the bag out to him. Stone took it and opened the seal carefully. He unfolded the first napkin. Dates, names written phonetically as she'd heard them, a partial license plate number, 4 characters, and then a gap where she'd lost the rest. A phone number she must have watched someone dial and held in her head until she could write it down. The name R. Holden, spelled 3 different ways across different napkins. Holden, Holden, Holden with a question mark beside each version. Plus signs and minus signs beside staff names. Some system she'd invented to track who was kind and who wasn't. He unfolded the second piece. The third. A drawing, a man in a suit, a small figure beside him with an arrow pointing away from the suited man toward a door. Stone looked at the collection of paper in his hands, at the weeks of careful observation, at the methodical accumulation of detail by a child who had decided on her own that the way to be believed was to provide proof. Where did you learn to do this? He said. My dad. She said it the way she said things about her father, matter of fact, with the clarity of someone describing a fixed point that remained constant regardless of circumstance. Before he had to go away, he said, if you want somebody to believe you, you have to give them the things that prove it, not just words. Proof. James Holloway, Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge. Stone hadn't known anything about him an hour ago. He knew something now about a man who'd been teaching his daughter in whatever time they had had together how to survive without him. Your dad sounds smart, Stone said. Rosie looked at him directly. He made a mistake, she said. That's why he had to go away. But he's still smart. Stone looked at the Ziploc bag, at the weeks of evidence assembled on napkins in secret, because her father had told her that proof mattered more than words, and she had believed him and acted on it. Can I keep this? He said. She nodded. I made it for somebody. A pause. I thought it should be you. 17 minutes later, Karen Slater arrived with a blanket and a cup of gas station and hot chocolate that had cooled on the drive. She got out with the professional calm of someone who had been doing hard work long enough that the shapes it came in stopped surprising her. She took in Rosie in the oversized jacket, Stone sitting on the cold ground, Knox at the corner. She absorbed all of it. I'm going to take you somewhere warm tonight, she said to Rosie, and in the morning we're going to make sure things are different. Rosie looked at Stone. Stone held her gaze. I'm going to make some calls, he said, starting tonight. Promise? The word came out clean and simple, the way 6-year-olds ask things without the softening adults learn to apply to questions that required accountability. He thought about what to promise meant when you couldn't fully control the outcome. He thought about Fallujah and 3 Men and the promises you made to yourself that the specific outcome had made impossible to keep and the weight of those for the rest of a life. Yeah, he said, I promise. Karen wrapped Rosie in the blanket. Rosie kept Stone's jacket underneath it. Karen noticed, chose not to address it. She took Rosie's hand and walked her to the car. At the car door, Rosie turned and raised her hand slowly and pressed her palm flat against the air between them. 5 fingers. Stone raised his hand, 5 fingers back. The car door closed. The car pulled away. Tail lights in the dark fading through 2 blocks and then around a corner and then gone. Knox walked over. He stood beside Stone on the sidewalk and was quiet. She kept records, Stone said, on napkins, in a Ziploc bag, for weeks. Knox looked at where the car had been. Her dad taught her, he said finally. Yeah. Knox pulled out his phone. Gunner's going to want to know. Call him and tell him I need him watching the group home in Billings tonight. Nobody moves Rosie without us knowing. Stone stood on the sidewalk in the dark and thought about the name Gloria Roth. which he'd heard through channels that information moved through when it was important enough to travel, even when the people carrying it couldn't fully explain why. A former caseworker who'd filed an internal complaint 2 years ago and been transferred to a records desk for it. A woman who'd been sitting on something and hadn't yet found the right person to hand it to. He thought about what Frank Decker had shown him and what Frank had deliberately not shown him and the distance between those two things. His phone lit up. Unknown number. A photograph. It loaded slowly through the cold weather signal. When it resolved, his blood went cold. Rosie. Inside a room at the group home in Billings, sitting on a cot looking at the wall, shot from outside through a window close enough that whoever took it had been standing on the facility's property within arm's reach of the glass. She was looking at the wall. She had no idea anyone was watching. Below the photograph, 3 words. Back off now. Stone read the message. He looked at the photograph. At the angle, the distance, the window frame, at the edge of the image. Someone in Holden's network had positioned themselves near Rosie within the last hour and taken this photograph and sent it to Stone's phone, which meant they had his number, which meant they'd been watching him as closely as he'd been watching them, which meant the assumption that he had more time than he did was wrong. He called Knox. Knox came. Stone showed him the phone without saying anything. Knox looked at the photograph with the expression he used for things that required a response rather than a reaction. He handed the phone back. We go to Gloria Roth tonight, Knox said. Right now. Stone forwarded the photograph to Gunnar Pierce with 2 words, watch closer. Gunnar replied in 30 seconds done. Then Stone called Darnell. Darnell answered on the second ring, coming fully awake fast. I need you to drive tonight, Stone said. Long drive. I need someone who doesn't look like what we are. Can you use your wife's car? A pause. The sound of feet on a floor. A decision being made quickly. 9 minutes, Darnell said. Gloria Roth lived in Missoula, 2.5 hours west on roads that were icy in patches and empty at that hour. Her house was on the east side of the city, a neighborhood of small yards and chain-link fences and porch lights that stayed on through the night. White siding, a brown door, a single juniper by the front steps. What was inside was 14 cardboard boxes. Stone saw them through the window before Gloria opened the door, stacked against every wall of the front room labeled in black marker, with dates and case reference numbers, some going back 9 years. A woman's entire professional conscience boxed and carried from one address to the next because she couldn't let it go and couldn't yet figure out what to do with it. Gloria Roth was 44 years old, dark hair shot through with early gray, eyes that moved quickly and assessed before they settled. She opened the door on the chain, looked at Stone, looked at Darnell, looked at Knox at the curb. You're the biker, she said, not a question. Frank Decker called you, Stone said. 20 minutes ago. She studied his face with the attention of someone making a decision. He said you'd probably come tonight. She unchained the door. Come in. The house smelled like old paper and coffee and the dry quality of a place heated carefully in a Montana winter. Gloria moved through the boxes the way you move through furniture. You'd stop seeing her body finding the gaps automatically. She sat them at a kitchen table and poured coffee without asking and stood across from them with her arms crossed. How much did Frank tell you? Stone said. The pattern, Holden, the financial angle. A pause. He didn't mention Nathan. Nathan Decker is in the payment ledger, Stone said. Family court intake coordinator Billings. He's been routing children into Holden's pipeline. 11 payments over 18 months. Something moved across Gloria's face. Not surprise. The expression of a person hearing a piece confirmed that they'd suspected but couldn't prove. I filed an internal complaint 2 years ago, she said. I had the pattern, the financial correlation, names. 3 weeks later, I was transferred to a records desk with no windows and case files from 2009. She looked at the boxes on her walls. I understood the message. Why did you keep the documents? Because I have a daughter. She said it simply. And because there's a difference between not knowing what to do and destroying the thing you'd need when you figured it out. She went to one of the boxes and found a manila folder without searching. She knew exactly where everything was. She set it on the kitchen table. Stone opened it. A spreadsheet, handwritten, then photographed and printed. Columns of names, dates, placement, IDs, dollar amounts. He looked down the column of initials in the far right. Found the ones he was looking for. Found others. The initials in the last column, Gloria said. A county court clerk, 2 caseworkers in the Billings DFS office, and at the bottom circled. She turned to the last page. A name in red pen. Nathan Decker. 12 payments over the 18 months I documented. Total just over $23,000. Corresponding dates match 11 placement transfers I've verified. Stone looked at the circled name, then at the list of children on the facing page. Ages, placement histories, behavioral notations. He found Rosie's name, fourth from the top. Age 6, 4 placements. The notation beside her name transfer accelerated post-Shepherd House visibility. Transfer accelerated because 31 bikers had stood on Maple Street and made her visible. Because Holden had moved her before visibility could become investigation. Stone had done the thing he'd come to do, and in doing it, had triggered the response he hadn't anticipated. He sat with that for a moment. "We need to get this to the FBI field office in Helena," he said. "I know," Gloria said. "I've known for 2 years. I needed someone the network hadn't compromised, and someone with enough reach to move the documents before Holden could block it." She looked at him. "Frank said you were both." "Agent Dana Keller at the Helena field office," Stone said. "She's been building a case on Holden for 8 months independently. She needs a primary witness with physical documentation." Gloria's arms tightened across her chest. Her eyes went to the hallway to the door down it with a crayon drawing taped to it. She looked at it for a moment. "If I go on record and this doesn't hold, I'll make it hold," Stone said. "You can't promise that." "No," he said. "But I'm going to try harder than anyone has tried in 2 years, and you've run out of other options." Gloria looked at him across the table. At the folder, at the 14 boxes, at the crayon drawing on the door. Then she nodded. The nod of someone who had been waiting for something and had decided this was as close as it was going to get. "Holden will know something's moving by morning," she said. "Once he files an emergency order claiming the documents are stolen, state case materials, it goes to civil court and disappears for months." "How long do we have?" "Until he finds out we're moving. An hour, maybe less." Stone looked at Darnell. Darnell was already on his feet. "Start loading," Stone said. Then Knox's voice came from the front doorway, low and immediate. "Stone, outside." Stone was through the door in 4 steps. Knox stood on the porch pointing down the block. 3 black SUVs parked. Lights off, engines running, exhaust rising in pale columns against the dark sky. They'd been there long enough to settle, long enough to have watched Stone go inside. Stone stood on the porch and looked at them, counted exhaust columns. He thought about the photograph of Rosie on the cot. He thought about Gloria's daughter and the crayon drawing on the door. He went back inside. 3 vehicles outside. They're watching, not moving yet. "We still have a window." He looked at Gloria. "Your car is in the back. 2-car garage, the Accord. Darnell takes you and as many boxes as will fit. Back gate lights off until you hit the cross street, then drive the speed limit to the 93 north to I-90. Don't take the direct route." He looked at Knox. "Knox takes 3 boxes on his bike runs parallel on the back roads. I run interference out front." Darnell and Gloria loaded the Accord from the back garage, box by box moving fast. Knox secured 3 boxes to his rack with cargo straps from his saddlebag. 8 minutes start to finish. Stone called Gunner Pierce. Gunner answered immediately. "I need you on I-90 eastbound in 20 minutes, Stone said. "Darnell is running the Accord with the witness and documents north on the 93 to pick up I-90. Holden has people watching my current location." "How many riders?" "However many you can move in 20 minutes. A brief pause, the sound of a room changing energy. 23. Chapters have been on standby since your text about the girl. Don't intercept until Darnell's on the 93. I don't want anyone counting bikes before the Accord is clear." "Understood." A pause. "Stone, is she going to be okay?" Stone thought about Rosie pressing her palm against the car window. 5 fingers. "She will be," he said. He ended the call. Then he walked to the front of the house and stepped out onto the porch in full view of the 3 SUVs. He stood there with his arms at his sides, looking directly at the vehicles. Not aggressive, not retreating, fully present in the way that men who'd stood in worse places than a Missoula residential street knew how to be present completely without flinching, without performing anything. Behind the house, very quietly, the Accord pulled out of the back gate. One of the SUV doors opened. A man got out. Broad 6'2", dark coat. He crossed to the edge of the property line and stopped. "You need to go home," the man said. Stone looked at him across the front yard. "No. The woman in that house has materials belonging to the state child welfare system. She's a private citizen with documents she created on her personal time," Stone said. You need a court order to call them state property and you don't have one, or you'd have led with it. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his stance recalculated. This can be resolved quietly. Quiet is how it's lasted 11 years, Stone said. We're done with quiet. The man looked past Stone at the front of the house, making his own calculation about what was still inside. The people behind this operation have reach. You haven't encountered, the man said. They will come for your club, every member. They'll find violations, real or otherwise. I've had people with reach decide to use it before, Stone said. I'm still here. The man held his ground for 3 full seconds. Stone counted them. Then he got back in the SUV. The 3 vehicles idled for a moment, long enough to make a point about patience and resources. Then they pulled out and drove north until their taillights faded. Stone went back inside, picked up his helmet, and got on his bike. He ran north on the highway with his headlight high and moved at the speed of someone who expected to be followed, which he was one of the SUVs had repositioned and was behind him within 2 miles. He let it follow, let it watch him on the open road, while Darnell ran the back route with the Accord and the 14 boxes and Gloria Roth and 2 years of evidence that nobody in the network had managed to destroy. At mile 11, his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Darnell, 2 vehicles behind us. Been on us for 4 miles. How far to I-90? 6 miles to the junction. Gunner. Right here, Gunner said from the other connection. 2 minutes, Stone said. He saw them first, 23 sets of headlights coming from the north. The sound arriving just ahead of the light, that deep collective rumble, that was less a sound than a pressure in the chest, something felt before it was heard. Gunner's chapter cresting the highway grade and coming down in tight formation. 23 bikes finding their lines in the dark. They split. Gunner took 12 bikes east on the access road parallel to the highway. Stone swung wide and took 11 riders on the straight approach. They caught Darnell's position from 2 sides in 40 seconds, the Accord ahead on the highway, the 2 black vehicles behind it, and then suddenly the geometry changed and didn't change back. 11 bikes in front, 12 from the flank. The road filled with engines and headlights, and the 2 black vehicles caught between them with nowhere to go that wasn't a ditch. Stone braked hard at 50 yards and the convoy folded in behind him. 23 bikes spread across the road. Headlights on full. Engines at idle, the low, patient sound of machines that weren't going anywhere. One of the vehicles stopped. A man got out. Older than the man in Missoula, a coat that cost more. He stood in the headlight wash and looked at the line of riders. You're making this worse, he said. The documents are in federal hands before morning, Stone said. Step aside or stand there. Either way, that's what's happening. The man looked at the line, at Gunner's flanking group, at the road ahead and behind. He looked at Stone. Stone looked back. The man got back in the vehicle. Both SUVs reversed, found the gap, turned around, and drove south until they were gone. Darnell exhaled so completely his whole body deflated. Can we please get to Helena before I have an actual cardiac event? 26 vehicles moved north on I-90 in the dark. 23 bikes flanking a 10-year-old Honda Accord, carrying 14 boxes of documentation, and one woman who had been carrying this for 2 years and was finally able to put it down somewhere that could hold it. They arrived at the FBI field office in Helena at 4:47 in the morning. Agent Dana Keller was waiting at the front door. 51 years old. Compact, close-cropped hair. The stillness of someone who had been angry about a specific thing for a long time and converted that anger into methodology rather than noise. She came down the steps when the Accord pulled up and looked at the boxes in the trunk and looked at Gloria and said, I've been waiting 8 months for someone to walk through that door with what you have. 2 years for me, Gloria said. Keller looked at Stone. Gallagher. Yeah, you've caused an enormous amount of disruption in the last 48 hours. Is that a problem? She looked at 23 bikes behind him, engines off, riders standing in the pre-dawn cold. She looked at Gloria, at 14 boxes. No, she said, it's exactly what this needed. She picked up the first box herself. Inside, all of you, I have coffee. The coffee was institutional and bad. Stone drank 3 cups and didn't taste any of them. By 6 in the morning, the documentation was formally received and entered into evidence. By 7, a federal attorney was on the phone. By 8:15, the emergency court order that Holden's lawyers had filed at 6:45, claiming the documents as stolen state property, had been challenged before a federal magistrate, and suspended in 37 minutes. Stone sat in a plastic chair in the federal building corridor and felt the adrenaline leave his body. It left behind everything the adrenaline had been covering. The steel rod in his left leg ached from the cold, and the hours on the bike in a deep, specific way. His hands had a fine tremor. His eyes burned. His back carried the grinding exhaustion of a body pushed past what it wanted to do. Knox sat down beside him without being asked, handed him a bottle of water. Stone drank half of it. His phone rang. Frank Decker. He answered. Frank's voice was different from the diner from his front doorstep. Something had gone out of it, the quality of a man who had stopped managing something and had set it down, even though setting it down was its own kind of wreckage. I'm in the lobby, Frank said. I've been here since 4. I gave a full statement. Everything, the payments, the conversations, and Nathan's role, what I knew and when I knew it, and what I chose to do with that knowledge. A pause that had been prepared for a long time. All of it. Stone didn't say anything. He's my son, Frank said, not as an excuse, as an accounting, as a man describing the reason for the thing he'd done and acknowledging that the reason hadn't made the thing right. But she's 6 years old, and I spent 6 weeks deciding which of those things mattered more, and I was wrong about which one it was. I'm sorry for all of it. Stone looked at the hallway ceiling, at the fluorescent lights with their faint, persistent hum, the sound you stopped hearing until you stopped. I know, he said. He ended the call, looked at Knox. Frank turned himself in, he said. Knox nodded slowly. He understood the weight of it without Stone explaining the shape of the thing, which was one of the things about Knox. He could read the weight of an outcome without needing every dimension of it described. The arrest happened that morning. Keller moved simultaneously across the network, no gaps the way she'd said she would. Raymond Holden was taken from his home in Whitefish at 9:03. Nathan Decker was arrested at the Billings Family Court building at 9:11, still at his desk, still processing the morning's paperwork, which had a kind of grim irony to it. Beverly Oates was picked up at a gas station 22 miles east of Harlow Creek, which suggested she'd been tipped and hadn't gotten far enough. 2 caseworkers in the Billings office were suspended pending investigation. A family court clerk was arrested at his home. Frank Decker surrendered voluntarily at 8:15, 45 minutes before the warrants processed. He came alone. He gave a statement that Keller described to Stone in a hallway conversation at mid-morning as thorough and unreserved, naming every payment, every conversation, every moment. He'd chosen his son over the children, cycling through the system his son had helped to feed. He was 62 years old and he looked, Keller said, like a man who had put something down that had been taking pieces of him for a long time, even though the floor gave way when he put it down. Stone never saw Frank Decker again. He thought about calling once in the weeks that followed, decided against it. Not from anger, he understood, with a clarity that hadn't been asked, for the specific torment of a father who loved a child that was also a wrong he couldn't undo. But some things didn't have a conversation that made them better. The silence between them was its own kind of acknowledgement. It was the most honest thing they had left. The placement review for Rosie June Holloway was reopened within 72 hours of Holden's arrest. The state audited her file. 3 placements in 3 years under Holden's coordination. Each transfer triggered by manufactured instability. Each group home billing paid through the pipeline. Each behavioral notation in her file a reflection not of Rosie, but of what the system's repeated disruption had done to her and the system's need to justify the next disruption. The caseworker assigned to the review was a woman named Judith Harmon, 14 years in child welfare. The kind of institutional experience that produced either burnout or a very specific form of quiet fury, and she had landed on the latter and let it make her precise. Stone walked into the Harlow Creek Department of Family Services office on a Tuesday morning in January. He left the vest at home. He wore his cleanest clothes, not dressed up, because dressed up would have been a performance, and he wasn't there to perform. He was there to be accurate. Judith looked at his file. Military service, 2 tours medical discharge, the injury, the PTSD diagnosis, employment at the rail yard, 6 years, a disorderly conduct charge from 11 years ago, circumstances noted expunged, single, no partner, 1-bedroom rental. You live alone, she said, in a 1-bedroom. I'm in the process of buying a house, Stone said, 2 bedrooms. I've put earnest money down. He paused. I was planning ahead. Judith made a note. She looked at it, then at him. Why this child specifically? Stone took the Ziploc bag from his jacket pocket and set it on the desk between them. Judith looked at the careful, childish handwriting on the napkins inside the misspelled versions of Holden's name, with question marks, the partial license plate, the phone number a 6-year-old had memorized and written down because her father had told her that proof mattered more than words. Because she chose me first, he said. Then he told her everything. Not a shaped version, not the version that omitted the parts that made him look like a risk, the IED, the rod, the 19 years of carrying the guilt of a man who survived something 3 others didn't and spent a long time figuring out how to live inside that. The way something in Rosie's waving had connected to something in him that he didn't have a clean word for, except that he recognized it the specific courage of someone who kept trying in a situation that had given them every reason not to. He talked for 22 minutes. Judith stopped writing around the 8th minute. She just listened. When he finished, the office was quiet. The plant on the windowsill, the kind that looked like it had survived conditions it shouldn't have moved slightly in the heat from the vent. Judith looked at her closed notebook, at the Ziploc bag, at Stone. In 14 years, she said, you are the first person who has walked into this office and told me unprompted the exact things I was going to note as concerns in my evaluation, before I had the chance to raise them. She looked at him. Is that because you thought disclosure was the right strategy? No, Stone said. It's because they're true. Judith almost smiled. Small real, the kind of smile that meant something because of how rarely it appeared. 6 weeks, she said. Home study, background check, home inspection, interviews, parenting class. It is a process and it may not result in approval. And even if the board approves, Rosie has a voice in this. Her needs and her readiness are part of the equation regardless of the paperwork. I understand. And if the board decides a different placement is more suitable, Stone was quiet for a moment. Then I'll deal with it, he said. But I'll try not to give them a reason to. Judith closed her notebook. 6 weeks, Mr. Gallagher. He drove back to Harlow Creek with the windows down despite the January cold. The highway was empty. The pine trees along the ridge held their dark green against the white sky. He drove and let the air move through the cab and thought about the Ziploc bag in his jacket pocket, which was where it was going to stay until he had somewhere better to put it. Knox called. How'd it go? 6 weeks, Stone said. Home study. Knox was quiet for a moment. That's not a no. No, Stone said. It's not. Gunner's chapter is running Saturday. He asked if we wanted to join. Tell him yeah, Stone said. The 6 weeks were not easy in the way that things worth doing were rarely easy in the way you wanted them to be. The home study involved a caseworker named Briggs who came to the house. Stone had bought a 2-bedroom on the east side of Harlow Creek, a yard with a pine tree at the back corner, a furnace that worked a 2nd bedroom he'd painted and furnished and asked questions that required him to articulate things he'd spent years not articulating. He answered all of them, because he told Judith Harmon he would be accurate, and he intended to be. The 2nd bedroom had a bed frame and a dresser and curtains. The curtains had been a problem. He'd stood in the home goods store for 20 minutes holding 2 different sets. One cream with a thin stripe, one yellow with small white flowers. He couldn't decide between them in a way that felt proportionate to the purchase of curtains. Darnell had come with him and watched this for as long as he could manage before calling his wife from the aisle. She needs to come here, Darnell told her. He's drowning in curtains. Window curtains. Just yes, please. Darnell's wife arrived 20 minutes later, looked at both sets for 4 seconds, chose the yellow with the white flowers and said, the cream is fine for an office. This is a child's room. Stone paid for the yellow curtains. He was grateful in a way that didn't have good language. The parenting class was held in a church basement on Wednesday evenings. 11 other adults. A retired school teacher, a man of 26 who reminded Stone of himself at that age, minus most of the damage, which Stone found both hopeful and quietly humbling. The instructor covered attachment theory and trauma-informed parenting and age-appropriate communication with the specific care of someone who understood that the people in front of her had all come from different starting places. Stone took notes. He was by 20 years the most attentive student in the room. He'd also started counseling in the 2nd week of the home study. A therapist named Dr. Whitmore, who worked out of an office in a converted Victorian on Harlow Creek's main street. 60 years old, 30 years in practice, the quality of someone who had heard a great deal and remained through all of it genuinely interested in what the next person was going to say. Stone had sat across from her for the first session and not said anything for 4 minutes. She'd waited, which told him something about her. Then he started talking. He talked about Fallujah, about the three men, about the titanium rod in the 19 years of carrying the weight of surviving something others didn't. He talked about the dreams, about the way his hands still tensed on the handlebars on blind curves even in Montana, about the way he'd organized his life into a shape that had no room for anything that could be lost, and about a 6-year-old girl in a faded orange shirt who had reorganized it without asking. Dr. Whitmore listened. At the end of the first session, she said, "You've been treating your own survival as a problem to be managed rather than a fact to be lived with. That's common. It's also very tiring." Stone sat with that. "Yeah," he said. "We're going to work on the distinctions," she said. "It takes time, but you've got time." He thought about that on the drive home. He was still thinking about it in the second session, in the third, and in the quiet ways that things you were working on lived in you while you were doing something else, appearing in the middle of welding a seam at the rail yard, in the moment between lying down and sleep coming, when the thoughts arranged themselves without being invited. There was a room down the hall with yellow curtains now, and a person who would wake up in it and come to the kitchen in the morning, and he wanted to be as accurate a version of himself as he could manage when she did. Darnell's character reference was 4 pages long and included midway through the third page the line, "There is no person I would more willingly trust with my daughter's life, and I mean that in the literal sense, which I don't say lightly, as a man who has a daughter." Stone read it 3 times and put it down. Knox's reference was 1 paragraph. He had told Stone it would be shorter than Darnell's and would say more. He was right. 200 words in Knox's handwriting, everyone chosen that said what they needed to say without ornamentation. Gunnar Pierce sent a letter unsolicited on Iron Ridge Riders, Billings chapter letterhead signed by 31 members. Stone read it in his truck in the parking lot of the Family Services building and sat there for 4 full minutes before he trusted himself to drive. The letter from Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge arrived in the 4th week of the home study. It came in an envelope with the prison's return address printed in plain black type. Stone almost didn't open it, unfamiliar handwriting, no name he recognized on the outside. Then he turned it over and read the sender's name, James Holloway. He opened it at his kitchen table. 1 page, handwritten in careful block print, the writing of a man who had thought about every word before committing it to paper. It said, "My daughter's caseworker told me about you. She said you stood in the cold for hours trying to get Rosie safe. I want you to know something. Rosie has never waved at anyone the way she waved at me. Every visit, every time I had to leave, she waved until I was out of sight. I didn't know she'd found someone else to do that for until Karen told me. I think you need to know what that means coming from her. If you're going to raise my daughter, I only have one request. Don't tell her that her father is a bad man. Tell her that her father loved her and made a mistake. Both of those things are true. I don't know if you're the right person for her, but I know she picked you, and Rosie doesn't pick wrong." Stone read the letter 3 times. He folded it along its original creases. He opened the kitchen drawer where he kept the Ziploc bag and placed the letter beside it. He sat at the table for a while in the quiet of the house. Outside, the January wind moved through the pine tree at the back corner of the yard. He thought about a man in a prison 200 miles away who had taught his daughter that proof mattered more than words, and who had written 1 page of his own proof and sent it across Montana winter to a man he'd never met asking for one thing in return. He got up and stood in the doorway of the second bedroom. The yellow curtains, the small bed, the dresser with nothing on it yet. He stood there for a minute in the quiet, then he turned off the light and went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, he slept before the dark left him. Judith Harmon called on a Thursday evening in the 5th week. Stone was standing at the kitchen window when his phone rang. He answered. "The board approved the placement," Judith said, "pending Rosie's final interview on the 28th. If she confirms January 31st as move-in." A pause. "She hasn't been told your name. She knows there's a potential permanent placement under review. Would you like to be present for her interview, not in the room, but in the building?" "Yes," Stone said. He arrived at 9:15 on the morning of the 28th, sat in the waiting room. The coffee from the machine was worse than Patton's, a magazine he didn't read. In the corner of the room there was a small fish tank. He looked at it for a while, counting. 3 fish. At 10:07 the door opened. Rosie came through it with Judith Harmon and Karen Slater. Blue sweater, jeans, shoes that fit both the same pair tied. Her hair in 2 braids that weren't quite even the left one, slightly looser than the right, which meant she'd done them herself, or mostly herself. She was looking at the floor the way she always approached new spaces, reading the room before she raised her eyes. Then she raised her eyes. She saw him. She stopped walking. The two women on either side of her stepped slightly apart, giving the moment room without making it a production. The waiting room was very quiet. The fish tank hummed. The fluorescent lights did what they always did. Rosie looked at him. Several things moved across her face in rapid sequence. Recognition, and then disbelief, and then something careful and very still that she held like something she was afraid to disturb. She took one step toward him, then another. Then she walked across the waiting room and stood in front of him and looked up at him, the way she'd been looking up at things her whole life, with the full, serious, unhurried attention of a child who had learned that the only reliable method was to look long and carefully before deciding. Then she reached out and took his hand, both of her small hands around one of his. His hands were scarred at the knuckles and calloused from 20 years of work and did not look gentle by any measure. She held them anyway. "Are you keeping the room?" she said. Stone's throat closed. He worked around it. "Yeah," he said. "Well, it's yours if you want it." She considered this with the gravity she brought to all important questions. "Are there curtains?" "Yeah." "What color?" "Yellow, with little white flowers." She thought about this, a moment of genuine deliberation. "Yellow is okay," she said. "Good." She kept holding his hand. She looked over at the fish tank in the corner. "How many fish are there?" Stone looked. "3," he said. She looked at him. "I see 4." He looked more carefully. There in the back right corner, half behind a plastic plant, a 4th fish moving slowly in the space he'd missed. "You're right," he said. 4. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had confirmed that the world was paying appropriate attention to details. January 31st came with 6 inches of new snow and a sky the pale, even white of a day that hadn't decided yet what it was going to do. Stone and Darnell drove to Sunrise Group home in Darnell's truck because Darnell had stated firmly and without room for debate that he was coming, and Stone hadn't argued because he didn't want to, and because Darnell was right that this was not a moment to do alone. They drove most of the way in the comfortable silence of men who'd been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. The highway was plowed. The pine trees along the ridge held their white weight. Judith met them at the door with a single document. Stone signed it on the hood of the truck, the pen cold in his grip, his handwriting more careful than usual. Rosie came out at 10:30. She had a backpack and a paper grocery bag with the top folded down neatly. Everything she owned fit in those 2 containers. Stone reached for the grocery bag without being asked. She let him take it without comment, which was its own kind of thing. They walked to the truck. Darnell opened the rear door. Rosie climbed in and looked at the back seat with the careful attention she brought to new terrain. "There's a seat belt," Darnell offered. Rosie looked at him. "I know how seat belts work," she said. Darnell looked at Stone over the roof of the truck. Stone looked back at him. Darnell's face did something complicated that he managed to keep from becoming anything either of them would have to acknowledge. Stone got in and started the truck. They drove north through the January snow. Rosie sat in the back and watched Montana go past the window. The plains white and flat, the pine ridges dark against the white sky. After a while, she said, "Are there other people, the ones on the bikes?" "Yeah," Stone said. "Do they know about me?" "They do." She looked back out the window. "Are they going to be around?" "If you want them to be." She considered this with her characteristic unhurried thoroughness. Then she went back to watching the window. After another mile, when the snow moved sideways across the highway, in the wind fine and dry, the kind that migrated rather than accumulated, she said, "Okay." Just that, the verdict of someone who had decided to try. Stone drove and said nothing. In the rearview mirror, he could see her watching the white landscape go past. He could see the way she leaned close to the window, sometimes breath fogging the glass, the way children investigated things that interested them. The morning after Rosie moved in, Stone woke at 5:30 the way he always woke, not gradually, not from a dream, but all at once. He lay in the dark for a moment listening to the house. The furnace, the wind outside, the pine tree at the corner moving in the dark. And then a sound he hadn't heard in this house before. A drawer opening and closing, very quietly. He went down the hall. The door to Rosie's room was slightly ajar the way he'd left it, but the light was on inside. He knocked. "Come in," she said. Her voice was awake and stern, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. He opened the door. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed with the Ziploc bag open on her lap, the one she'd given him outside Shepherd House, which he'd placed in the kitchen drawer. She'd found it sometime in the night and brought it here. She was looking at the napkins, not reading them, she already knew what they said, but looking at them the way you looked at something you'd made under difficult circumstances, assessing it from a distance, now that the circumstances had changed. Stone leaned against the doorframe. Couldn't sleep, he said. I woke up, she said. I do that sometimes. She looked at him. Do you? Yeah, he said. I do that sometimes too. She looked back at the napkins. I kept these for a long time, she said. I know. In the group home, there was a girl who went through other people's things. I had to find a new hiding place every few days. She said this without particular emotion, the logistics of a previous life stated as facts she'd adapted to. I kept them in my shoe for a while, but they got wet. You dried them out. On the radiator. She looked at one napkin. The writing got blurry on this one, but I remembered what it said. Stone came in and sat on the edge of the bed. Rosie didn't move away. She'd stopped measuring that particular distance about a week ago, which he'd noticed and hadn't commented on. You did something really smart, he said, keeping records. She thought about this. My dad said documentation is the difference between a story and a fact, she said. Stories people can argue with, facts they can't. Stone thought about Frank Decker in the diner, the folder half open on the table between them. He thought about a man in Deer Lodge who'd given his daughter a more useful education than most people received in all the formal years of schooling, and who'd done it in whatever time they'd had before he lost access to her, and she'd carried it forward and used it in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Your dad's right, Stone said. Rosie carefully refolded the napkins and put them back in the Ziploc bag. She sealed it, held it for a moment, then held it out to Stone. You can keep it, she said, in case you ever need it. He took it. I'll put it somewhere safe. The kitchen drawer, she said. He looked at her. She looked back with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was close to the expression of a child who had found something out and found it satisfactory. You looked in the kitchen drawer, he said. I looked in all the drawers, she said. Before I went to sleep, I look at all the places in a new place. To know what's there. To know where things are, she said, in case I need them. Stone sat with that for a moment. The specific kind of grief that wasn't for Rosie or for himself, but for the general fact of a world that had made a 6-year-old methodical about exits and contents in places where things were kept in case she needed them. The kind of grief you didn't express, because expressing it would put weight on the person who'd been carrying the cause of it. You can put things in the drawers too, he said. In this house, the drawers are for both of us. She considered this as a specific and significant offer. Okay, she said. Go back to sleep, he said. I'll make breakfast when you wake up. What kind do you want? She thought with the seriousness she brought to decisions. Eggs, she said, the kind with the runny part. Over easy. Is that what it's called? Yeah. Okay. She lay back and pulled the covers up. Over easy. Stone turned off the lamp, stood in the doorway. Night, he said. It's morning, she said. Morning, he said. He heard her almost not smile in the dark. He went back to the kitchen and sat at the table with the Ziploc bag in front of him and the first gray light of January beginning at the window's edge. He thought about James Holloway in Deer Lodge waking up this morning the same way he woke up every morning behind the same walls. He thought about the letter in the drawer and the part that said, I know she picked you and Rosie doesn't pick wrong. He put the letter in the Ziploc bag in the kitchen drawer side by side. Then he got up and started the coffee and waited for the day to begin. 2 weeks after Rosie moved in on a Saturday morning, the Iron Ridge Riders came through the east side of Harlow Creek at 8:17 on a new route Stone had mapped the week before. The new route was longer 12 minutes of additional riding through residential streets before the highway, and no one in the chapter had said anything about the extra time, which was the only comment on the matter that was necessary. 23 bikes. They rolled past the house at 8:17. Rosie was on the porch, blue coat, shoes tied. Her breath came out in small, even clouds in the cold air. She stood at the top of the porch steps and looked at the approaching convoy with her characteristic, careful attention, reading it before committing to a response. Then she raised both hands. 23 riders waved back. She laughed. A short sound surprised out of her before she could decide whether to release it genuine and unprepared and bright in the cold morning air. She laughed and kept waving, both hands moving her red-brown hair, catching the wind off the ridges. Stone, riding third in the formation, heard it from the street. He looked over his shoulder. She was still there, still waving, still laughing. He faced forward. The highway opened up ahead straight and long, and white-shouldered, the kind of road that went somewhere and kept going. He rode. That spring, Rosie started first grade at Harlow Creek Elementary. Her teacher, Mrs. Alcott, called Stone on a Tuesday afternoon in March. He stepped outside the rail yard to take it. Mrs. Alcott said Rosie was reading slightly above grade level and had made 2 friends and still paused at doorways before entering rooms, but that she'd stopped worrying about that particular habit because she'd realized it wasn't anxiety, it was thoroughness. Rosie was a child who assessed situations before committing to them, which was, Mrs. Alcott said, a quality that would serve her well. Then she said she told the class her dad rides a motorcycle. Stone stood outside the railway yard in the spring air, which had finally come off the southern plains carrying something warmer than Montana had offered since October. He held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. The warmth moved through him, the kind of warmth that arrived after a long winter and surprised you with how much you'd forgotten it felt like. "Mr. Gallagher." "Yeah," he said, "I'm here." A pause. "Thank you for calling." He stood outside for another few minutes after the call ended, looking at the rail lines, at the freight wagons lined up in the yard, at the pine trees at the edge of the property, still holding a little of the winter in their upper branches, even as the ground below showed the first green. That evening after dinner, macaroni and cheese that Rosie evaluated and told him needed more salt, which was correct and which he agreed with. Stone stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. The snow was gone. The ground was still brown in most places, but at the base of the fence where the yard got the most afternoon sun, something was coming up. Small and green and deliberate, pushing through the cold ground with the determination of living things that had been waiting and had finally decided the conditions were adequate. He hadn't planted anything. He didn't know what it was, but it was there, on the refrigerator behind him, held up by a magnet shaped like a moose that Darnell's daughter Cora had given Rosie on the day they met, was a drawing Rosie had made 4 days after she moved in. She'd asked for crayons and sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes with her full, focused attention. When she was done, she'd brought it to him without comment and stood beside him while he looked at it, present, but not pressing, letting the thing speak and watching to see if it was understood. He'd looked at the drawing for a long time. A house, this house, the 2-bedroom with the pine tree in the yard, a truck in front, 2 stick figures in the yard, one tall and one small, the taller one with a beard indicated by short crayon lines, and beside them in a careful row along the bottom of the page, 14 small oval shapes, each one slightly different from the last, each one drawn with the intentionality of a child representing something important. He'd asked her what the ovals were. She'd looked at him like the answer was self-evident. "The motorcycles," she'd said. "The first ones, the ones from the beginning. 14 bikes. The original convoy. The ones that had come through at 6:47 every morning for 3 months and waved at a girl standing on a cracked sidewalk in a faded orange shirt with both arms raised, waving back with everything she had." Stone looked at the drawing on the refrigerator. From somewhere east of town, carried on the warmer air, he heard engines. Several of them, far off the low collective register of Harleys on open road, unhurried, moving through the spring evening. The sound of men who had somewhere to be and were taking the long way to get there, because the long way was the point, because the road itself was the thing. He listened until the sound faded into the kind of quiet that was different from the absence of sound, the quiet of an evening that had been full of something and now held the memory of it, which was its own kind of presence. The green things at the base of the fence moved slightly in the evening air. Stone looked at them for a moment longer. Then he finished his coffee, rinsed the mug, set it on the drying rack, and went to check if Rosie needed anything before bed. The light was on under her door. He knocked. "Come in," she said. She was sitting up in bed with a book, an early reader from school, a story about a dog and a girl, and a series of small problems that resolved themselves by the last page. She was at the last page, which she finished while he stood in the doorway, her lips moving slightly, the way they did when she was reading, carefully. She closed the book and looked at him. "The dog found his way home," she said, "even though he was lost for a long time." "Yeah," Stone said. She looked at him with her steady eyes. She'd stopped needing to measure him as often as she used to. The measurements had been taken enough times that the results were consistent, and she'd started to rely on the consistency the way you relied on a fixed point. It was happening slowly, the way trust happened when it was real rather than performed. "Okay," she said. She lay back and pulled the covers up. He turned off the lamp, stood for a moment in the doorway with the light from the hall behind him, and the yellow curtains holding the last of the evening, and the small shape of her settled in the bed that was hers now, in the room that was hers now, in the house that was theirs. "Night," she said. "Night," he said. He pulled the door to not all the way because she'd asked him not to close it all the way, and went back down the hall to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while looking at the yard and the green things at the fence and the pine tree at the corner, holding perfectly still in the windless evening. He stood there until he was ready to stop. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The Iron Ridge Riders came through at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. In September, the light already changing from the flat white of summer to something thinner and more golden, the particular light of early fall in Montana that made everything look like a photograph of itself. Rosie was on the porch. She was always on the porch now, for the morning pass, rain or shine. She'd put it in her schedule. She kept a schedule written in her careful block letters on a piece of notebook paper taped inside her school folder, and she kept to it with the methodical consistency she brought to all things that mattered to her. Stone rode third of the formation. He could see her from half a block out, the small figure on the porch steps, the red-brown hair loose in the morning. He could see the moment she saw them, the way she came to attention, both hands coming up. She waved. 23 riders waved back. Stone waved too from his place in the formation and kept riding the convoy, holding its shape and its rhythm through the familiar streets and out onto the highway, where the road opened up and the speed came up with it, and the morning spread out ahead of them, gold and cold and long. He thought about her on the porch getting smaller in his mirror as the distance grew. He thought about the first morning he'd seen her there 3 months before she disappeared, 3 months before any of it, the arms, the frantic waving, the desperate, unfiltered hope of a child who had decided that if she waved hard enough and long enough, something might stop. Something had stopped. Not right away, not the first morning or the 50th, but eventually, because she kept waving. He rode east toward the rail yard in the morning's work, and the sound of the convoy filled the air around him, familiar and steady, and the gold September light came down through the pine trees along the ridge and laid itself across the road. And somewhere behind him, on a porch on a street in Harlow Creek, a girl with red-brown hair lowered her hands and watched the last of the bikes disappear around the corner and then went inside to get ready for school. He'd see her at dinner. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. It was more than he'd known how to want for a long time. And he was learning slowly the way things worth learning were learned, to let it be exactly what it was, which was his life and hers, in the particular shape they made together in a house with yellow curtains and a drawing of 14 motorcycles on the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a moose, and green things growing along the back fence that nobody had planted. But that grew anyway, because that was what living things did when they finally had the space to do it. He kept riding. The road kept going. It was a good morning to be on it. The home study inspection had come in the 3rd week of the 6 weeks. Briggs was a methodical man in his 40s who carried his clipboard with the specific authority of someone who understood that his role was to assess without judgment and had practiced that distinction until it was real. He came on a Thursday morning and spent 90 minutes in the house. He looked at the kitchen, the bedroom, the second bedroom, the yard. He tested the smoke detectors and checked the cabinet locks on the cleaning products and noted the presence of a first aid kit and the absence of unsecured firearms, which Stone didn't have and never had. He sat at the kitchen table and asked questions from a list and wrote down Stone's answers in the shorthand of someone who did this enough that he no longer needed complete sentences. At the end of the 90 minutes, Briggs closed his clipboard and looked at Stone with the expression of a man who had one more question and had been deciding whether to ask it. "The second bedroom," what he said. "You put it together recently, 6 weeks ago, before you knew if the placement would go through." Stone looked at him. "Before I knew." Briggs wrote something down. His face was professionally neutral, which was different from actually neutral, and Stone had been around enough people in his life to know the difference. Whatever Briggs wrote down was not a concern. It was something else. "Is there anything you want to tell me that isn't on the form?" Briggs said. The question that came at the end of every home study inspection, the open door that most applicants didn't walk through because they'd been coached not to offer information that wasn't specifically requested. Stone thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "The kid who's going to be living here has been in 4 placements in 3 years, and 3 of those were manipulated by a coordinator who was using her as a revenue source. She's learned to assess situations before she commits to them. She looks in all the drawers when she moves into a new place. She keeps records of things that worry her. She wakes up at 5 in the morning sometimes, and she's already fully awake when she does. He paused. I do too. We haven't talked about that yet, but we probably will. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote something down. Thank you, he said. He closed his clipboard. After Briggs left, Stone stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. At the pine tree and the dead grass and the fence along the back where the green things would come up in spring. He thought about Rosie in her room at the group home in Billings, in a cot in a space she hadn't chosen with her Ziploc bag of evidence held against her chest. He thought about all the things that had happened between that moment and this one, and how fragile the line between them had been, and how many things could have gone differently. He went to the second bedroom and straightened the yellow curtains where they'd shifted slightly when Briggs opened the window to check the latch. He stood there for a moment looking at the room, the bed frame, the dresser, the curtains Darnell's wife had chosen in 4 seconds flat. The room that had been a calculation before it was a fact, a decision before it was a place, a promise before it was a room with a child in it. He turned off the light and went back to work. Darnell brought his daughter Cora to meet Rosie on a Saturday in the third week of February. Cora was 4 years old, and she arrived at Stone's house with the uninhibited energy of a 4-year-old who had been told there was another kid to meet and had decided to approach this as the best possible news. Rosie received Cora's arrival with her characteristic careful assessment, watching from the kitchen doorway while Cora came through the front door and announced herself to the room in the way of 4-year-olds who had not yet learned to modulate their volume for the size of the space. Then Cora saw Rosie. "Are you Rosie?" she said. "Yeah," Rosie said. "My dad says your dad has a cool motorcycle," Cora said. Rosie looked at Stone. Stone looked at Darnell. Darnell looked at the ceiling. "He has a lot of motorcycles," Rosie said to Cora. 14 usually, sometimes more. Cora's eyes went very wide. 14? At the beginning, there were 14, Rosie said. Now there are more, but I drew 14 because that's how many there were when I was watching. Cora processed this for a moment. "Can I see the drawing?" "It's on the refrigerator," Rosie said. Cora went to the refrigerator. Rosie followed. Darnell looked at Stone. Stone looked at Darnell. Neither said anything because nothing needed to be said. From the kitchen, Cora's voice examining the drawing. "That one's the biggest one." "That's Stone's motorcycle," Rosie said. "He rides at the front. Is that you, the small one?" "That's both of us," Rosie said. "Me and him, the 2 stick people." "Oh," Cora said. A pause. "That's nice." "Yeah," Rosie said. Darnell made coffee. Stone made sandwiches. Cora and Rosie sat at the kitchen table, and Cora taught Rosie a hand-clapping game that involved a specific pattern Stone couldn't follow, and that Rosie learned in about 4 minutes and then immediately became better at than Cora, which Cora responded to with the complete equanimity of a 4-year-old who had not yet developed a competitive streak about games she'd invented herself. In the afternoon, they went to the yard. Cora wanted to see the pine tree. Rosie showed her the green things coming up at the base of the fence, which she had been monitoring since they first appeared, and had decided after researching a library book about Montana plants were likely wild prairie clover. "They're pretty small," Cora said. "They just started," Rosie said. "They'll get bigger." "How do you know?" "Because they're growing," Rosie said with the patience of someone explaining an obvious thing. "Growing things get bigger. That's what growing means." Cora considered this a logic and found it sound. When Darnell left with Cora in the late afternoon, Cora stopped at the door and looked at Rosie. "Can I come back?" she said. Rosie looked at Stone. Stone looked at Rosie. "Yeah," Rosie said, "you can come back." Cora left with the confidence of a 4-year-old who had secured what she came for. After they were gone, Rosie sat at the kitchen table while Stone made dinner. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was processing something not withdrawn, just interior. At dinner, she said, "Cora's dad was there right at the beginning." Darnell, Stone said, "Yeah, he was riding sweep. He was the one who waved at you first." Rosie looked at her plate. "I remember. He did the salute thing." She demonstrated a loose, casual wave from the right hand. "I thought that was funny, because it was so easy. Like it wasn't a big deal." "It wasn't a big deal for him," Stone said. "He just saw you and waved. But it was a big deal for me," she said. "I know," Stone said. She was quiet for a moment. "I think I started waving harder after that," she said, "because I thought if I waved harder, maybe someone would stop." "Someone stopped," Stone said. She looked at him. "Not right away," she said, "not as an accusation, as a fact about how things had gone offered without bitterness, because she was at her core a person who dealt in facts." "No," he said, "not right away." She nodded and went back to her dinner. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the February cold pressed against the windows, the way Montana in February pressed against everything persistently without apology, but with the quality of a cold that had a spring on the other side of it, even if the other side was still weeks away. She asked about the military on a Sunday morning in the fourth week. They were at the kitchen table, coffee for Stone and hot chocolate for Rosie, which had become the Sunday morning arrangement. She was drawing. He was reading the paper, which he'd started getting delivered again, because Rosie had asked why there wasn't one, and he hadn't had a good answer. She looked up from her drawing. "Were you scared?" she said. He looked at her over the paper. "When, in the war, when you got hurt." He put the paper down, thought about the accurate answer, which was the only kind he decided to give her. "Yeah," he said, "before and after, not during. During it happened too fast to be scared." She considered this. "Is that how it works?" "Sometimes, when things happen fast." "What were you scared of before?" He thought about it. "That I wouldn't do the right thing," he said, "when it counted." "Did you?" He looked at the table, at the coffee cup, at the paper folded to the side. "I tried," he said. "Not always, but I tried." Rosie looked at her drawing. She'd been working on something with yellow and green crayons, and he could see now that it was the yard, the pine tree, the fence, the small flowers coming up at the base. She'd captured the pine tree with some accuracy, the triangular shape, and the dark spiky branches. The flowers were larger than they were in reality, but they were the right color and in the right place. "I was scared in the van," she said, "the first time. When they took me away from Shepherd House, I didn't know where they were taking me." "That was the right thing to be scared of," he said. "I waved at you," she said, "even though the window was dirty. I saw you." "Did you know where they were taking me?" "Not then," he said. "I found out later." "And then you came to find me." "Yeah." She added a few more strokes to the pine tree. "I knew you would," she said, not with drama, just as a statement about what she'd understood to be true. Stone looked at her. At the drawing, at the pine tree rendered in green crayon by a 6-year-old at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning in Montana. "How did you know?" he said. She looked at him. The considering look that preceded the things she said that were most worth saying. "Because you waved," she said. "Every morning, even when you didn't have to, even when you were going somewhere else." She went back to the drawing. "People who wave at you when they don't have to, they're telling you something." Stone held his coffee cup. The kitchen was warm. The Sunday morning was quiet around them, in the way Sunday mornings were quiet in this house. Now a different kind of quiet than it had been before, full, rather than empty, occupied, rather than waiting. "What are they telling you?" he said. Rosie thought about it. She drew a careful line the base of the fence. "That they see you," she said. "That you're real to them. That you're not invisible." Stone looked at the kitchen window, at the yard beyond it, the ground and the pine tree, and the place along the fence where the green things were growing small and determined in the cold ground. He thought about a girl standing on a cracked sidewalk in a faded orange shirt with both arms raised, waving at 14 motorcycles every morning for 3 months, and what she had been saying with all of that waving. He understood it now in a way he hadn't fully understood then, not until she'd told him clearly and simply, in a kitchen on a Sunday morning over hot chocolate and a drawing of a pine tree, that she was real, that she existed, that someone needed to know it. "Yeah," he said, "that's right." She finished the base of the fence, looked at the drawing from a slight distance, assessing it. "I'm going to put this one on the refrigerator too," she said. "Good," he said. She got up and went to get the tape. In March, Rosie planted sunflowers along the back fence. She'd researched it at the school library. With the specific thoroughness she brought to things she'd decided to do correctly, she had a paper with notes on proper depth for the seeds, proper spacing, and the number of hours of sun the spot along the fence received each day, which she'd timed with Stone's watch. She planted them in a line, 6 seeds each pressed into the ground at the depth. Her notes specified each spaced the distance. Her notes specified each covered and patted down with the same small, careful hands that had written, "Please don't go away," in unsteady pencil on a soft piece of paper, and pushed it into a stranger's saddlebag on a frozen December morning. Stone knelt beside her while she worked the knee, complaining the rod in his leg, acknowledging the cold ground in its direct way, and handed her things when she needed them and stayed out of the way when she didn't. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the 6 small spots of turned earth. "Now we wait," she said. "Now we wait," Stone said. She looked at the spots for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Do you think they'll come up?" He looked at the ground. at the 6 careful spots, at the determination they represented. "I think they've got a pretty good chance," he said. She nodded, satisfied. The way she was satisfied when the arithmetic was right. They went inside and washed their hands, and Stone made lunch, and Rosie told him about a book she'd started at school, a chapter book about a girl who solved problems with a particular kind of methodical attention that Rosie found deeply relatable. Stone listened and ate his sandwich and thought about how this had become, without his fully noticing the transition, the texture of his days. Not easy. There were nights when Rosie woke and couldn't say from what, and Stone sat on the edge of her bed and didn't say anything and didn't leave, and eventually she went back to sleep. There were moments when she retreated into herself in a way that was sudden and total and required him to simply wait, visible and present and patient, until she came back out. There were questions he didn't know how to answer and answered anyway as honestly as he could. There were moments when the weight of what she'd been through was visible in her, in a way that nothing he could do would immediately address, and those moments asked something of him that wasn't skill or knowledge, but simply the willingness to stay. He stayed. That was the thing he could do that mattered most, and he understood this more clearly as the weeks went on, that what she needed above all other things was the daily, unremarkable, undramatic confirmation that he was still there, that the situation hadn't changed, that the drawer in the kitchen still had the Ziploc bag and the letter from her father in it, and his wallet, and his keys, and the things that accumulated in a drawer that belonged to someone who lived somewhere and intended to keep living there. She checked the drawer sometimes. He noticed. He didn't comment. He refilled whatever had been used and didn't rearrange what was there. The sunflowers came up in the second week of April. Rosie found them in the morning, still in her pajamas, earlier than usual. She came to the kitchen and looked out the back window and made a sound that was not quite a word, but that Stone understood without translation, and he came to the window and looked. 6 small green shoots, thin and tentative but unambiguous, each one exactly where she'd planted it, each one exactly as described in the library book. She turned and looked at Stone. Her face had the expression of someone who had done a thing correctly and was experiencing the confirmation of it. "They came up," she said. "They came up," he said. She looked at them for another moment. Then she went to get ready for school. Stone stood at the kitchen window after she left, at the 6 small shoots along the fence, at the prairie clover that had spread a little further since March, at the pine tree at the corner of the yard fully in leaf, now in the spring warmth, the branches moving slightly in the morning wind. He thought about the morning in December when Rosie had pushed a piece of paper into his saddlebag at a red light, and he'd found it that night and sat at his kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and 7 words in unsteady pencil, and the weight of a man who knows something has started and cannot see where it ends. He thought about where it had ended, which was here, which was this kitchen, this window, this yard with its sunflower shoots and its prairie clover and its pine tree. This house with its yellow curtains in the second bedroom and its fish-shaped magnet on the refrigerator, holding up a drawing of 14 motorcycles and 2 stick figures in a yard. This morning, this window, this man standing in the kitchen where someone else had made hot chocolate and gone to school. He thought about what a promise meant. The one he'd made on a cold sidewalk at 3 in the morning to a 6-year-old who had asked him to account for himself. The weight of saying yeah and meaning it, and then doing over the weeks and months that followed the things that meant it was true. He thought about James Holloway in Deer Lodge, about the letter in the drawer, about the part that said, "I know she picked you and Rosie doesn't pick wrong." He stood at the kitchen window for another minute, looking at the yard and the green things growing in it, small and determined and exactly where they were supposed to be. Then he poured a second cup of coffee and went back to work. Gunner Pierce came through Harlow Creek in late July with 8 riders from the Billings chapter who'd made a specific detour for no stated reason. Rosie was on the porch when they came through, which she often was in the mornings, and Gunner had stopped the first time the convoy had ever stopped on this particular street and gotten off his bike and walked up to the porch and looked at the sunflowers, which by July were as tall as Rosie's shoulder, turning their faces to track the path of the sun. "Those are good sunflowers," Gunner said. "I planted them in March," Rosie said. "The ground was still cold." Gunner looked at them. "Cold ground, good roots," he said. Rosie considered this. "Is that a thing?" "My grandmother used to say it." "Was she a gardener?" "She was a lot of things," Gunner said. "A gardener was one of them." He tipped his chin at Stone, who was standing at the edge of the porch, and got back on his bike, and the 8 riders from Billings rolled on slow and low down the street and away. Rosie watched them go. Then she looked at Stone. He drove a long way to come by. Yeah, Stone said, he did. She looked at the place where the bikes had been. Because of me, she said. Not with vanity, with her need to understand the accurate shape of things. Stone thought about the right answer. Because of all of it, he said. Because of what it meant. To all of us. She stood for a moment looking at the empty street. Then she went back inside and Stone stood on the porch in the summer morning and listened to the distant sound of 8 engines diminishing to the south and thought about all of it, what it meant and what it had cost and what it had produced. Which was standing in the kitchen right now, probably getting a glass of water and thinking about cold ground and good roots. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, when he examined it directly, the best thing he had ever had anything to do with. He'd been part of building it from the ground up in cold ground in the middle of winter, the way things with good roots sometimes started. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. Rosie was at the table with a glass of water and a book. She didn't look up when he came in because she didn't need to. She knew the sound of his footsteps, the way she knew all the sounds of the house, which she'd memorized in the first weeks and still updated quietly against any changes. He poured a glass of water and sat across from her. She read. He drank his water. The summer morning moved past the kitchen windows, bright and warm and long. The kind of morning that lasted and let you be in it. After a while, she looked up. What are you thinking about? She said. He considered the question. Cold ground good roots, he said. She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Close enough. Yeah, she said. She went back to her book. Stone drank his waters and looked at the yard through the window and didn't think about anything in particular, which was its own kind of thing when he was slowly in the way that things worth learning were learned, beginning to trust. The September morning. Rosie started second grade. She came to the kitchen at 6:15 earlier than usual, already dressed her backpack by the door, her lunchbox on the counter waiting to be filled. Stone was at the kitchen table with his coffee. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. New class, she said finally. An explanation. Yeah, he said. Different teacher. Mrs. Pelham, he said. I met her at the open house. She seems good. Rosie considered this. She sat down across from him and put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she made sometimes when she was organizing her thoughts. Does she know about me? Rosie said. Stone understood the question in its full dimension. It was not a question about whether Mrs. Pelham knew Rosie's name or that she would be in her class. It was a question about whether the information that mattered had traveled with her, the placements, the file, the history that she had been trying to outrun since she was 3 years old, and that had a way of arriving before she did. She knows you're good at reading and that you like to know how things work before you commit to them, Stone said. That's what I told her at the open house. Rosie looked at him. That's all. That's what matters, Stone said. She sat with that. Her hands came off the table. She looked out the kitchen window at the yard where the sunflowers had gone to seed, now the big heads hanging heavy and golden in the September light. They'd grown past Rosie's shoulder by August and past Stone's by the end of the month, which Rosie had documented with measurements written in her school notebook and noted with a satisfaction that was nearly scientific. Okay, she said. She got up and went to fill her lunchbox with the things they'd laid out the night before, which had become the routine, laying out lunch the night before so that mornings had one fewer thing to navigate. She moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had learned where things were and trusted that they'd still be there. Stone watched her. The specific ease of it, the way she reached for the refrigerator without checking, first the way she knew without looking which drawer had the plastic bags, the way she moved through the kitchen like someone who lived here because she did. He thought about the first morning he'd found her at the kitchen table at 5 a.m. with the Ziploc bag, and about how she'd tested the drawers before she went to sleep, and about what that had meant. He thought about how much distance there was between that morning and this one, and how the distance had been crossed not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones over easy eggs, in Sunday morning hot chocolate, and hand-clapping games and sunflowers planted in cold March ground. She zipped her lunchbox and shouldered her backpack and looked at him. Ready? She said. Ready, he said. He drove her to school the way he drove her every morning past the rail yard and down the main street and up the hill where Harlow Creek Elementary sat with its flagpole and its gravel playground and its line of yellow buses. He pulled up at the curb and she got out and she looked back at him through the window the way she sometimes looked at him, with the steady measuring eyes that had gotten something new in them over the past year. something that was the absence of constant vigilance, a kind of settled quality he'd started to notice and had been careful not to remark on because he understood that the things you remarked on had a way of becoming self-conscious. "I'll be here at 3, he said. "I know," she said. She walked toward the entrance with her backpack, and she didn't look back, which was different from how it had been in the spring when she'd looked back twice. He sat at the curb for a moment after she went inside. Just sat, watching the entrance. Then he drove to work. That afternoon when he picked her up, she got in the truck and put her backpack on the floor and said, "Mrs. Pelham is good. She has a fish tank." "How many fish?" Stone said. Rosie looked at him with the expression she'd used since the day in the waiting room at the family services office, the expression of someone who appreciated that he understood which questions were the right ones. "7, she said, "but one of them is hiding behind the castle thing at the bottom, so it looks like 6. "But it's 7, Stone said. "It's 7, she confirmed. He pulled out into traffic. The September afternoon was warm and gold, the way September afternoons in Montana could surprise you with warmth right when you'd started expecting the cold. They drove back toward home through the familiar streets. "Mrs. Pelham has us write in journals," Rosie said. "Every morning, whatever we want. What did you write today?" She thought about this for a moment. "About the motorcycles," she said. "About how they came every morning, and I waved, and eventually something happened because of it." Stone kept his eye on the road. "What did you say happened?" Rosie looked out the window. "I said I found where I was supposed to be," she said, "and that it took a long time and wasn't easy, but that it was worth waiting for." A pause. "Mrs. Pelham said that was very mature for someone my age." Stone said nothing for a moment. The road ran ahead of them through the September light. "Is it true," Rosie said, "that it was worth waiting for?" He looked at her. At the earnest, careful, serious face of a 7-year-old who asked questions she actually wanted answered and waited for the actual answer. "Yeah," he said, "it's true." She nodded, looked back out the window. "I thought so," she said. "I just wanted to make sure you thought so too." He drove home through the September afternoon, and the gold light lay across everything, and the pine trees held their dark green against the sky, and the town went past the windows, and ahead of them, the house waited at the end of the familiar street, and it was, Stone thought, a good place to be going. Knox came by on a Saturday in October unannounced, which was how Knox operated. He showed up when he had reason to, and didn't explain the reason unless asked, and he was rarely asked because the people who knew him understood that his presence was the explanation. He came around the back of the house where Stone was doing maintenance on his bike in the driveway, and Rosie was sitting on the back steps with a book, and he looked at the garden along the fence, where the sunflowers had been cleared and turned under, and the ground had been prepared in the way Rosie had decided it should be prepared for whatever came next spring. Knox stood looking at the turned earth for a while. He had his coffee in his hand, which meant he'd come around from the front and helped himself to the pot on the counter without being invited, which was something he had started doing in August and which Stone had decided not to comment on. "What's going in next year?" Knox said. Rosie looked up from her book. "Sunflowers again," she said, "and sweet peas, and something called bee balm because I read that it brings pollinators." Knox looked at the garden plot. "Good thinking," he said. Rosie went back to her book. Knox came over to where Stone was working and crouched beside the bike and looked at what Stone was doing with the same silence he brought to everything, which was a comfortable silence, the silence of a man who didn't feel the need to fill space. After a while, Knox said very quietly in the register he used for things that were specific and considered, "She's doing all right." "Yeah," Stone said. He kept working. "She is." Knox drank his coffee. The October afternoon was cold now. The real cold that meant winter was done being suggested and had started making statements. The pine tree at the corner had changed slightly. Not losing leaves being a pine tree, but something in the quality of the light falling through it, the way fall changed everything slightly without changing what it was. "Paulie from the Billings chapter asked about her," Knox said. "Just asking." "What did you tell him?" "That she planted sunflowers and they came up," Knox said. Stone looked at him. Knox looked back with the expression of a man who had said exactly what he meant to say. "That's enough," Stone said. "Yeah," Knox said. "That's what I thought." He finished his coffee and went back inside to leave the mug on the counter and let himself out the front, and Stone heard the sound of his bike starting on the street and pulling on and went back to his work in the October afternoon, with Rosie on the back steps, reading her book in the turned earth of the garden along the fence, catching the last of the afternoon light. The year turned. December came back to Harlow Creek the way it always came, abruptly, without ceremony, the temperature dropping, and the pine trees going white, and the highway getting its winter quality, that particular flatness of a road in snow. Stone drove Rosie to school in the mornings and picked her up in the afternoons and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table and read the paper while she did her homework. On the weekends, they did the things that needed doing and sometimes the things that didn't. The library on Saturday mornings, where Rosie approached the selection of books with a methodical seriousness that the librarian had come to recognize and appreciate, and Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with coffee and hot chocolate and whatever Rosie was drawing or working on. It was in its accumulation the texture of a life, not a dramatic one, not one that would look like anything from the outside, except two people in a house who had found their way into the same routine and were not looking to change it. One Sunday morning in December, exactly 1 year after the convoy had come through Maple Street, and 31 bikers had stood in the cold and waited, and child services had come, and 7 children had walked out into the afternoon light, Rosie looked up from her drawing and said, "It's been a year." Stone looked at her. "Yeah," he said, "it has." She looked at the kitchen window at the yard where the garden lay dormant under a thin layer of snow. "I didn't know it would be like this," she said. Like what he said, she thought about it. The considering look, the careful assembly of the right words. "Regular," she said finally. "I didn't know it would feel regular." Stone held his coffee cup. The Sunday morning was quiet and warm and familiar in the way that Sunday mornings had become the same coffee, the same light from the window, the same sounds of the house around them. "Is regular good?" he said. Rosie looked at him with her steady eyes. "Regular is the best thing," she said. "Regular means it's yours." Stone looked at the kitchen window, at the yard, at the pine tree at the corner, white-shouldered with the first December snow absolutely still in the windless morning. He thought about a girl standing on a cracked sidewalk in a faded orange shirt with both arms raised, waving at 14 motorcycles every morning for 3 months. He thought about 7 words in unsteady pencil on a soft piece of paper. He thought about a man in a prison in Deer Lodge who had taught his daughter that proof mattered more than words, and about the proof that had accumulated in this kitchen over the past year, in over easy eggs and hot chocolate and Sunday mornings, and a drawing of 14 motorcycles held up by a moose-shaped magnet and sunflowers that came up from cold ground in April and grew past both of them by August. "Regular," Rosie had said. "Regular means it's yours." "Yeah," Stone said. He looked at her. "It does." She went back to her drawing. Outside, from somewhere east of town, the sound of engines, not the convoy, just a couple of riders running the Sunday morning highway for the pleasure of it, the way people did when the road was clear, and the cold was the right kind, and there was nowhere particular to be except out there on it. The sound came and went, moving through the still December air. Stone listened until it faded. Then he refilled his coffee and sat back down and looked across the table at the girl who had waved until something stopped, and who had been right to keep waving, and who was now drawing something at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning in December in a house that was hers. He picked up his paper. The morning continued. In January, on the anniversary of Rosie's first day in the house, she made him a card. She'd done it at school in secret and put it home in her backpack and left it on the kitchen table before he came downstairs. He found it with his coffee, a folded piece of construction paper orange, which he understood was deliberate. On the front, she'd drawn 2 stick figures on motorcycles, which was not technically accurate, since he only rode one motorcycle and she did not ride one at all. But he understood the spirit of it. Inside, in her careful block letters, it said, "To Stone, 1 year. I waved and you stopped. Thank you for stopping. Rosie." Stone sat at the kitchen table with the card in his hands for a long time. The house was quiet. The furnace ran. Through the kitchen window, the January yard was white, and still the pine tree at the corner holding its shape in the cold morning light, the garden plot along the fence dormant under snow, waiting for whatever came next. He heard her on the stairs. She came into the kitchen and looked at him, holding the card, and she was very still for a moment, reading his face the way she read rooms when she entered them carefully before committing to anything. "Good still or bad still?" she said. He looked at her. "Good," he said. She relaxed in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you knew what you were looking at, which he did. She went to the refrigerator and got out the carton of eggs and set it on the counter. "Over easy," she said. "Over easy," he said. She cracked the first egg into the pan with the specific confidence of someone who had practiced a thing until it was no longer difficult, and the kitchen filled with the sound of it and the smell of it, and the ordinary particular miracle of a Sunday morning in a house where two people knew where things were and trusted that they'd still be there. Stone put the card on the refrigerator beside the drawing of 14 motorcycles held up by the moose-shaped magnet. Then he got up to make the coffee, and the morning began. There was an evening in late January, a Tuesday, when Rosie came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip to the Natural History Museum in Billings. She set it on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at it and didn't say anything. Stone looked at it from across the table. "Billings," he said. "Yeah," she said. He understood what was in that word. Billings was the group home. Billings was the 90 miles of highway they'd run in the dark with 23 bikes and an Accord full of evidence. Billings was the city where Nathan Decker had processed paperwork at a family court desk, and where the machinery had turned for months around a 6-year-old who didn't know it was turning. It was also just a city 90 miles south with a natural history museum that had dinosaur bones and a geology exhibit and a room full of taxidermied Montana wildlife that second graders went to see on field trips. "Do you want to go?" Stone said. Rosie looked at the permission slip. Her hands were flat on the table the way they got when she was organizing her thoughts. "Yes," she said. "Mrs. Pelham says the dinosaur bones are really big." "They are," Stone said. "I've seen them." She looked at him. "You've been there?" "A long time ago," he said, "when I was maybe 12. She considered this the fact of Stone at 12, which was clearly something she'd never thought about before. "Were you different?" she said. "Yeah," he said, "smaller." She almost smiled. "I mean different, like your personality." He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about things she asked. "I think I was the same kind of person," he said, "but I didn't know as much yet about what that meant." Rosie nodded slowly, filing this. Then she picked up the permission slip. "Can you sign it?" "Yeah," he said. He got up and found a pen in the kitchen drawer, the one beside the Ziploc bag, and the letter from Deer Lodge, and signed the form and handed it back to her. She looked at his signature. Then she put the permission slip in her backpack for tomorrow. "The dinosaur bones are going to be really big," she said again, with the specific satisfaction of someone confirming a thing they're looking forward to. "They are," he said. She went to wash her hands for dinner, and Stone stood at the kitchen counter and thought about a city 90 miles south and about all the things that word had contained and all the things it would contain going forward, which was dinosaur bones and field trips, and a second grader who assessed situations carefully before committing to them, and who had decided after due consideration that the bones were going to be really big and that this was worth going to see. He started making dinner. The kitchen was warm. The evening was settling around the house in the way it settled, now familiar. Expected the specific weight of an ordinary evening in a place that had become somewhere. Outside, the January cold pressed against the windows, and inside the lights were on, and the stove was on, and somewhere down the hall, Rosie was washing her hands and would be back in a minute. And there was dinner to make, and a morning after this one, and another after that. Each one adding its small weight to the accumulation of days that Stone had come to understand exactly what a life was made of. He kept cooking. The evening continued.